For a discussion of how our new schools are funded, I'll turn things over to Julie Salvo in Facilities Planning.
Even in the most perfect planning process, we still cannot overcome the issue of funding. OCPS is very fortunate that we have several funding sources to help us build schools. We have more money and resources than most other districts in the state. And we certainly are building and renovating more schools than other districts right now and in the foreseeable future. But in the early 2000s, funding was definitely an issue. Up until 2005, developers were only required to pay a very low impact fee, and that fee was not in line with the rising costs at the time. The sales tax that we currently have in place was voted into effect in 2002, but it took a little bit of time for that money to come in and start accumulating. We were heavily dependent upon borrowing in the state for funding, and their process is very difficult. A district basically has to demonstrate that there is no capacity district-wide in order to obtain funding from the state, and even then those dollars have a lot of strings attached. So we are fortunate that today we have a healthy impact fee, which was implemented first in 2005, and it's fluctuated over time. And that also the voters approved in 2002 and then reapproved in 2014 the half-penny sales tax. These initiatives allowed us to move things ahead at a much faster pace than other districts in Florida. The $1 billion capital budget that comprises about 1/3 of OCPS's overall budget, and it's funded primarily through the half-penny sales tax, property tax, and impact fees. The funds are used to build new schools and also to renovate existing schools. As I mentioned, most of our capital funds are locally generated. This chart shows how much new revenue is projected by each type of funding source over the next 5 years. Toward the bottom of the chart, the dark blue, red, and green are all local funding sources. At the top, the orange and light blue, which you really can't see, are state funding sources. The light blue, which I increased it so you can see it better, it's just under the orange, that represents the PICO funds. OCPS receives about $2.4 million per year in PICO funds, and those are directed to maintenance. Most of the PICO fund that we used to receive has now been directed to charter schools. And this year, charters in Orange County will receive about $6 million in PICO funds. The orange line at the very top of the chart represents revenue we receive from a surcharge on auto license tags. We receive about $6 million annually from this fund, and those funds must be used on life safety capital needs. Neither state fund, the PICO or the auto tag fund, can be spent on new capacity. This leaves us with our local funding sources: the half penny, the impact fee, which is paid by developers when they pull building permits, and property tax. The half penny that was instituted in 2002 is earmarked for a voter-approved list of to renovations for 136 existing schools. We are almost through that list, and the sales tax that was reinstated in 2014 will be used for other renovations and technology upgrades that support digital curriculum, and it may also be used for new schools. The impact fee is paid by developers each time a new house is built. Impact fees may only be used for new capacity, so this is the primary funding source for brand new relief schools. The property tax is a large locally generated revenue source that pays for debt service, major systems replacements in existing schools, and bus replacement. This pie chart shows how our capital funds are spent. Our largest capital need is the renovations and replacements of our existing schools, which is funded primarily by the half-penny sales tax. The next category is debt service. The third largest category is district-wide capital and capital renewal, which covers things like major system replacements like air conditioning and other improvements to existing schools. It also covers the infrastructure needed to support the digital curriculum. The fourth largest category is new schools, which are funded, as I said, by impact fees. We receive a lot of questions about impact fees because they're required on all new housing units. Per state law, impact fees can only be spent on new capacity. They must be calculated based on a formula of student station costs. They currently comprise about 13% of our capital budgeted revenue and are spent primarily on new relief schools. We are getting ready to start a new study this year to update the school impact fee and make sure that the current fee that we're charging aligns with current costs. This chart compares our past and projected impact fee balance, which is in green, to the projected expenditures, which is in brown. We get a lot of questions about our impact fee fund balance, which has gotten pretty high at times. We allow our impact fee fund balance to build because we are essentially saving up for a new relief school or schools. Schools are expensive and the money has to be in the bank before we can spend it. Similar to when any of us get a paycheck, we allocate our money for specific bills or expenditures, and hopefully we're putting some aside for future expenses that we know might occur. The impact fee fund is very similar. You can see a large spike in expenditures in 2017, the brown line. That represents Windermere High School construction, among a few other projects. In 2021, we will experience a similar spike, but because we're building 2 high schools that year. But in this case, the fund balance won't actually be sufficient to cover those expenses. So we will be dipping into other sources of funding that year to help pay for those 2 high schools and the other projects we have opening in that time period. Before I get into the final type of capital dollar we receive, which is mitigation from developers, let me give you some background on how we got to this point of being able to collect mitigation in the first place. Back in the 1980s, Florida enacted the first Growth Management Act that required concurrency for most forms of infrastructure like roads, parks, police, and fire. In a nutshell, concurrency means that capacity must be available to serve new development, and growth is required to pay for itself. Schools were not included in the Growth Management Act until 2005. So back in the early 2000s, the County Commission enacted some changes that got the school district involved in residential development review, and this opened the door for OCPS to have a seat at the table when it came to reviewing development and requiring mitigation. In 2005, concurrency finally took effect for schools, but in 2010, the Growth Management Act was overhauled and the state eased back on many of its growth management requirements, which included making school concurrency optional. Fortunately, OCPS was protected at that time by an interlocal agreement with all the municipalities in the county and a charter amendment which was approved by voters. So it remains the law of the land here in Orange County. So because we have these local processes in place, OCPS has 2 key mitigation processes that we use for every single development that comes through Orange County in excess of 10 units, the capacity enhancement process and concurrency. They are both review processes that occur at different times in the development process, but essentially most residential projects are reviewed twice by OCPS. If the affected schools are overcrowded, we require a mitigation agreement before that project can get approved by the local government. The city and the county, they go along with this. They have to per our interlocal agreement. But the agreements that we enter into require the developers to pay an additional contribution or mitigation, and this money goes into our capital fund. However, we cannot collect this money until the developer has all project approvals and is actually ready to build. And this chart just summarizes how OCPS reviews developments and where payments are made. We conduct our initial reviews early in the process when a developer seeks a future land use map amendment or a rezoning, and then our second review is conducted at site plan. The developer pays their mitigation just prior to plat, and they pay their impact fees at building permit, and that's when we receive that money. So to summarize, developer paid mitigation can only be spent on new capacity and can only be collected prior to plat approval. This means we can't collect developer money until all their approvals are in place. If there's a chance they might not build, we should not be collecting that money. The amount we collect is actually quite small in comparison to our other funding sources, but what it actually does is complement the impact fee, which falls slightly short of covering an entire cost of a student station. For example, in 2016, we collected $1.8 million in mitigation, which is typical in any given year. For comparison, an elementary school costs about $20 million to build. The agreements we entered into for that year pledged over $32 million, but that money will come in slowly as the plats for individual developments are approved, which can take many, many years. A final note, this mitigation is only charged to developers that are building in overcrowded school zones. So if a developer is doing a project in an area that has plenty of school capacity, we do not enter into a mitigation with those developers.